Welcome back, everybody, to this final session in our conference today. Our final speaker has been greatly anticipated. It's Aziza Akhmouch, Head of the Cities, Urban Policies and Sustainable Development Division at the OECD. And she's joining us live from Paris today, which we're very excited about. Based in Paris, Aziza oversees a team providing governments with new data, evidence, analysis and guidance in a wide range of urban policies that aim to foster smart, inclusive, competitive and sustainable cities around the globe. Aziza oversees the OECD Metropolitan and National Urban Policy Reviews and a broad range of thematic work related to housing, transport, cities and inclusive growth, cities and the environment, metropolitan productivity and governance, and localising the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, we're really thrilled, as I said, that Aziza's joining us live today from Paris, where it's still very early in the morning, just after 6:30. So we're very, very grateful that Aziza has made such an early start on our behalf. I'd like to remind all of you listening to please submit your questions in the Q&A panel so that we can have a little discussion with Aziza at the end of her talk as well. Aziza, thank you so much once again, and appreciate you getting up early in the morning. It's the end of our conference here and the end of our workday, so we're probably in quite different headspaces, I'm sure, but no doubt we'll really enjoy hearing what you have to say. So thank you. Over to you, Aziza.
Thank you so much, Tom, and really delighted to be with you all today. And congratulations on the conference. I had a scan through the agenda, and many of the items that you've been discussing throughout the day are very spot on and echo a lot of the concerns that mayors and ministers from OECD countries at large have raised over the past few weeks and months, in particular in these pandemic days. So thank you for the invitation. Really delighted to share with you some of the takeaways that have come out of OECD's work on cities and urban policy, and in particular in relation to what the pandemic is changing for the design and sustainability of our cities in the future. I'll be giving some examples here and there on Australia from time to time, but the idea is really to give you the global perspective and the big picture of what the main headaches are for local and national policymakers when it comes to urban policies. And what I suggested doing is basically scanning through three main blocks in my presentation. The first one, to give you a quick overview of what we have crystallized as the 10 paradigm shifts and lessons from the crisis for the cities of the future. I'll then provide a more in-depth zoom on what we see as the main sustainability hotspots for cities and regions in advanced economies. And then I'll conclude on national urban policy, because at the OECD for over 2 decades, we've relentlessly told national governments, regardless of their levels of decentralization, that they have a big role to play to get our cities right. Now, if we turn to the first block of the presentation, 3 months after the pandemic, we did at the OECD, my team, a major stock taking of how 100 cities across all 38 OECD countries responded to the pandemic in the very short term with emergency measures, but also in longer term perspectives, in particular contributing to recovery packages design or shaping their own local recovery strategies. And we have really seen to which extent this pandemic, as all health crises in the past, by the way, was an eye-opener, a magnifier, a sort of a catalyst for change in our cities, not so much revealing new pressing issues, but let's say stressing the emergency to fix what we typically call at the OECD the agglomeration costs that come from this spatial concentration of people and firms in large cities. And each of these paradigm shifts somehow reflects a number of policy priorities that many OECD countries are now having probably better on their radar screen. The first one is that managing territorial disparities was a big challenge, regardless of whether countries were federal or unitary. What we've seen in the very first instance of the pandemic is that governments at national level tended to have a very place blind approach to their response, designing nationwide measures that then had to trickle down at subnational level, regardless of the capacities in place, of the specifics in place. This applied to lockdowns, but this also applied later to a number of economic, social, and environmental measures. And to some extent, it was positive and reassuring to see that during the recovery phase, there was a greater awareness for this place-based approach that would better reflect, let's say, different situations across cities and regions within the same country, and sometimes within large metropolitan areas. And this came actually with varying capacities of local and regional governments to absorb the shock and rebound based on their exposure to tourism, inclusion in global value chains, and based on their industrial composition, cities that had ports and many export related activities were plagued with a number of challenges up front. Others that relied extensively on mass tourism also required targeted measures. And going more granular, in understanding those capacities was also something that many governments struggled with and somehow tried to catch up with in the recovery phase. The third big shift that you have probably experienced in Australia as well is this shift from what we used to call a logics of mobility, making people move from point A to point B in cities, to one of accessibility. Many urban dwellers realized that actually what was important for them was to have around their neighborhood, access to a large set of amenities, of services, that the commuting time with this teleworking revolution was no longer bearable. And a number of cities have started rethinking how they can revive their business districts, their city centers, and rethink the accessibility, the famous concepts of the 15, 10, or 20-minute city that we've seen spread in a way that was very viral, rethink their accessibility at the very local level. We've also seen how this crisis has deepened inequality, not only in terms of income, and some countries did have bold containment measures from national governments, signing checks for a few months, if not a few years, but inequality in terms of well-being. First, the vulnerable groups that were particularly exposed because physical distancing or stay at home when you don't have a home doesn't sound in the same way, but also inequality that were somehow magnified in relation to your housing quality, in relation to your access or not to green amenities, in relation to the types of job that you were carrying out. And there as well, probably stronger awareness during this pandemic, and local governments in particular being really on the front line of driving a number of measures to contain these inequalities. A very interesting paradigm shift we're also seeing from the OECD standpoint is this huge potential to unlock the contribution of mid-sized cities to regional development and national productivity. This idea that growth cannot be confined only to large metropolitan areas scattered throughout a country, even if we know large metropolitan areas in OECD countries account for 60% of jobs, 60% of GDP, and 60% of the urban population, has gained a lot of traction because, and that's the next item, of this digital revolution, which is really the main difference compared to previous health crises that have all triggered urban redevelopment. This idea that we have managed with the teleworking revolution, but also online servicing, telemedicine, online education, and so on, to partly substitute some digital proximity to the traditional physical proximity that justified this concentration of people and firms in urban settings, and generated, let's say, the productivity that we know exists in our cities. And this teleworking revolution is opening avenues for many urban dwellers to rethink whether they are living in large metro areas because they want to, or because they have to. They have to being because they have to work. And in the very first days of the pandemic, we heard a lot of things, sometimes many myths, about people quitting large cities to settle down in rural areas. This may have happened marginally during the lockdowns, but what we see in reality is that this major exodus is not happening, because people are living in large cities not just for work. They live in large cities also for the quality of services that they're providing. But the flip side of the coin is that there's probably a card to play for those mid-sized cities that are close to those large cities and can continue to borrow some of these agglomeration benefits, while maybe providing a slightly better quality of life if they invest in infrastructure, in the built environment, in fiscal governance capacity, transport, and so on. And so this may gear us towards a much more balanced and polycentric urbanization in OECD countries than we've seen so far, in particular after the so-called metropolitan century. The environmental awareness and the need to drive this just and green transition, where the following day to COP26 in Glasgow, has also made a number of solutions way more acceptable socially and politically than they were just 2 years ago. Thinking about cycling, all this tactical urbanism, whereby mayors were able to take very quick decisions, make very quick fixes to maintain certain levels of mobility, while addressing this anxiety of public transport, trying to contain the weight or return of individual cars, driving transitions towards circular economy, local loops, and so on. And those were transitions that just 2 years ago were facing massive resistance. Just in Paris, closing the Seine riverfront to cars and opening it to pedestrians led to a number of let's say, complaints to court, to the administrative court. And so there's this little window of opportunity that somehow can accelerate in urban settings the green transition. Seen with that is also the current state of play of social discontent and trust. And it was very interesting to see in OECD data that trust in local governments and politicians was actually much, much higher than trust in national governments. I mean, 2/3 of OECD countries' citizens, since the global financial crisis of 2009, have said they have no trust in the capacity of their national governments to ensure their well-being. And it's the opposite for local governments. 60% actually say they trust their mayors, their governors, their local politicians in terms of driving their well-being. And therefore, this need to renew the social contract has really put mayors on the front line of these policy responses. We've also heard a lot about resilience, which of course is not a new concept. It's existed for a decade. Maybe it was confined to issues of natural disasters, environmental issues, and disaster risk management at large. And what we've discovered maybe with this crisis is that we're going to have more frequent shocks in the future, and that they're going to overlap and to happen more or less at the same time. Many cities, while they were going on lockdowns, for example, were facing cyber attacks. And we realized that those that had in place disaster risk reduction plans, long traditions of resilience building, mainstreaming in their public administration capacity, were much better equipped in the very first instance than those that had not been exposed, let's say, to similar shocks in the past. And then, and that's the last point I'll develop in a minute, a big momentum for global agendas. If one could think that the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and so on are very far from mayors' daily priorities, I can tell you that while when it came to keeping a long-term perspective and shaping recovery packages, many have actually used these frameworks to take a number of decisions. Now, when we look at the measures that governments have taken, in the first instance at the local level, of course, it was mainly emergency measures, enforcing nationwide distancing, lockdowns, but also containing, as I said, vulnerability in communities, providing emergency housing support, um, uh, supporting local businesses and employment, SMEs in particular at the local level, the hospitality sector, raising awareness and communications. And it was really interesting to see how many local leaders used mobile apps, digital technologies to connect directly with their citizens, ensuring the continuity of local public services at times of crisis, and supporting what was in a very awkward way in many countries named as non-essential services, the culture and creative sector, which we know now is going to suffer from very long-term impacts, let's say, of these different confinements. And then there were a number of structural long-term transitions that really relate to building or rebuilding or building forward green, smart, and inclusive cities, leveraging the digital transition, the mobility shifts, sustainable consumption, and also reclaiming public space, which I think is very interesting in this ongoing movement about the right to the city and the spatial justice that comes with it. Now, when we look at the hotspots that we knew before the pandemic, but that were certainly magnified around those 17 goals, which, as I said, are goals that were committed by national governments, all 160 plus countries, to the UN, that they have to report every year on where they stand. When you look at each of them, you see actually a local lens. We have at the OECD developed what we call a territorial approach to the SDGs, where we qualify, we typify the local action that is needed for each of these goals and the 169 targets. And we see that over 2/3 cannot be applied without local and regional governments. And that's really the message to say it's not a compliance agenda for urban stakeholders, or let's say local and regional leaders, because those ultimately accountable are national governments, but it's a policy making tool. It's a way to make sure that at the very local level, when you address your hot potatoes, affordable housing, traffic congestion, air quality, a circular economy, and so on, you are doing it in a way that decisions or progress in one of these goals doesn't work against the other. It's really the systemic framework and long-term perspective that is behind. And with that, at the OECD, we've been doing a number of things. One is tracking the distance, measuring the distance of 600 cities and 600 regions to each of these goals. And this is what you see on the left side of the slide. Basically, we see that 70% of the cities and 80% of the regions being the second tier of government, and the provinces or states, in your case, are not on track to reach what we call the end value. So this is the dots, the black dots at the end of the circle, by 2030. And where most of these are lagging behind is on environmental related goals, anything that relates to protecting biodiversity, to adapting and mitigating climate change, supplying drinking water and sanitation, or preserving the state of water bodies, but also energy affordability and transition at large. And then we've also provided some guidance for governments to go very granular in this and link that to their regional development priorities and paradigms. And this is the most important, to say you need to shift from that old paradigm where basically we were building the attractiveness of metropolitan areas and productive regions in countries, and then subsidizing lagging regions, into something where we build on territorial assets. We shift from this one size fits all to context specific measures. We combine top down and bottom up. We move from sectoral to multi-sectoral. And this requires, in particular in countries like Australia, heavy coordination and effective multi-level governance across the different levels of government. Now, when you look at Australian cities in particular, I put two examples for you, but you can go online and play with the online tool. Just enter your city and then you see where you stand. We see that the two performing ones are Gold Coast and Canberra. You see the dot in dark blue is where the city that is spotted in the online tool stands vis-a-vis the end value. The gray is all the other cities of the country, and the orange is the national average. So you can see for each of your cities where you stand, and in regions we did also that, and we see Australian Capital Territory and Tasmania for the index at large tends to rank higher than other OECD countries. But this is really a proxy to then dive into the policy context and provide like more customized guidance, as we've been doing with dozens of cities and regions so far. One interesting finding is that when it comes to SDGs 11 in particular, so sustainable cities and community, Australia is actually among the countries that is performing the best, with half of your cities above 250,000 inhabitants having already reached the end value. The gray landscape is what we call the country average for all OECD countries, and the dark gray is the top 20. And you can see in green all your cities, you're close to the top 20. Um, and we believe most of the cities are actually on track for 2030. So it's not about the cities and communities targets only. It's also about the other sustainable development goals, in particular the environmental ones. And then we provided this sort of checklist for a territorial approach to the SDGs, which you can download online, which is really a policy tool for dialogue across cities and regions and across levels of government to get their policies, strategies, multi-level governance, financing, budgeting, data, information, and also engagement of stakeholders, SDG proof, if I can say so, so that they can fit for the future. Now, the last bit, I'll take 3 more minutes that I would like to emphasize is national urban policy for the reasons I mentioned before, because this is for us at the OECD really a strong point to say urban policy is not just about housing, and urban policy is not just an aggregation of sectoral policies that matter to cities, housing, transport, land use, and so on. Urban policy is really shaping a long-term vision. And even when you are largely decentralized, there's something to do at the federal level to connect the dots and to ensure this balanced quality urbanization, this polycentric urbanization that relies on a system of cities of all size and not just on large metropolitan areas. So with UN Habitat, we've been monitoring over the past 4 years now the global state of national urban policy. We've been basically doing a survey across 160 countries to see whether those urban policies are explicit or implicit, what are their main characteristics, what is their stage of development, how they are funded, how they foster or not coordination, whether they mainstream climate, and a number of other considerations. And the last edition that we released just a few months ago, back in June, was devoted to how governments are leveraging those urban policies at national level to go green, smart, and inclusive with their cities, and in particular to support some of the recovery packages implementation. And what we see is that in most cases, actually, those national urban policies can foster this strategic vision for the cities. They can bridge silos between different sectoral policies, and they help shape integrated urban development because they provide for the consultation and coordination mechanisms that are needed to that effect. They provide for the data, they provide for let's say the strategic vision, and sometimes also for the funding mechanisms that go with implementation. We've also seen an evolution since the last monitoring we did back in 2017 in terms of making these national urban policies more explicit. So over half of the sample of the 160 countries today has what they call an explicit form of national urban policy. I think in Australia you have what is called the Smart Cities Plan that is relying on a number of deals, six city deals, two being ongoing, and that aims for productivity, competitiveness, and so on. And many of these national urban policies, where they exist, are now already in the stage of implementation, while maybe they were more in the design and feasibility stage a while ago. But the most interesting finding, if we compare over the past 3 years, is that we have now almost half of those national urban policies that feature mainstream explicitly climate resilience, and provide for mechanisms to connect with line ministries that may be in charge of climate, environment, infrastructure, or related items. And this was only 32% 3 years ago. And so we see increasingly how connecting this urban and climate policy is becoming essential, because cities, are where 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions happen, half of solid waste produced, 2/3 of energy consumed. But there's still a number of challenges to make that connection really smooth, in terms of expertise, in terms of budget, in terms of coordination mechanisms, whether they're horizontal or vertical, and of course the staff capacity. But we see, and the COP26 was actually a step forward in terms of the presence of mayors and ministries that deal with urban development in those negotiations at large, that are not only led from an environmental or only environmental standpoint. And then the last point is that those national urban policies, they contribute, of course, to SDG 11 on cities, because there's actually one of the indicators of that sustainable development goal is whether you have or not in place a national urban policy that matches a number of criteria. But they contribute to way many more SDGs, including number 6 on water and sanitation, for example, number 9 on industry and innovation, number 13 on climate, and I could go on with the list. And in addition to the SDGs, they also make connections with the Paris Agreement, the Sendai framework. And so there is really a boulevard, let's say, an avenue for those global frameworks to play a significant role in raising the profile of urban development in national agendas. And I'll just conclude with this one. You can retrieve it online. Those are the 10 recommendations we have extended to all OECD and emerging economies we've worked with to design and implement effective national urban policies, so that they deliver their intended goals, and they contribute in the end to what all local and national decision makers are aiming for, meaning getting better cities for better lives, and increasing the well-being of urban dwellers. So I'll stop here. I look forward to some of the questions you may have. Those are my contact details in case you wish to access some of this OECD knowledge, and I'll be happy to get now into the discussion.
Great, thanks, Aziza. We really appreciate your presentation, particularly so early in the morning for you. We'll have a bit of a discussion now with some questions, but I'd just like to ask, first of all, you briefly mentioned the state of national urban policy in Australia. I wonder if you could make some comment, I guess, how the, and your final slide had I guess, some of those key, I guess, components or ingredients of a good national urban policy. Can you talk a bit about through your comparison internationally, how you see the Australian urban policy nationally operating, and perhaps in particular, if you could, I suppose, draw some comparison with other federal states, so that it's, I suppose, a useful comparison. Maybe Canada, the United States, Germany, and how are we? How do we stack up when put alongside those sorts of countries, and what do you see as, I guess, areas where we need to maybe think a little harder?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the first disclaimer I'll provide is that, contrary to 10 other OECD countries, we have not carried out at the OECD a national urban policy review of Australia. Those are like formal
Sure.
year-long exercises where we scan through, the documents that are in place. We talk to the stakeholders, and we provide this sort of external assessment alongside, let's say, policy recommendations. We did that for Mexico. We did that for Chile. Chile. We've just actually completed Colombia. In Europe, we worked with Poland. We worked with Korea, also in Asia Pacific, a lot with Japan. Australia is not there. So it's not a country where we have, like, let's say, this in-depth granular knowledge. Having said that, I think there's indeed, when you cluster OECD countries, you have varying degrees of policy intensity at national level based on their institutional organizations. If you take countries like Chile, Israel, Korea, that are extremely centralized, not only from a political standpoint, but also from an administrative and fiscal standpoint, national urban policies tend to be much easier to design, but they face huge implementation bottlenecks on the ground, because sometimes they're generating unfunded mandates whereby, the money just doesn't trickle down, and local and regional governments, which sometimes are not even elected, where we in Chile, we are in the process of appointing now regional governors, don't have the absorption capacity and the leeway and autonomy that is needed to think or rethink their cities from the ground up. When you go the other way around and you look at countries like, of course, Australia and Canada, US are the typical ones, but also Belgium, for example, that are very decentralized. There were interesting conversations in the light of the pandemic around the scope of what national urban policy could embrace. And some countries, for example, in some countries, we started hearing governments saying, we are not in capacity to manage, for example, this pandemic because health remains completely decentralized, and governments, let's say, wanted to even re-centralize health policy to provide for this nationwide measure. This was the case in Norway, for example. But what local governments in those federal settings realized is that their action to get their cities right and contain the pandemic should not be confined to the typical health box that was nurses, doctors, hospitals, a number of beds, per patients, but look at the broader socio-economic and environmental drivers and determinants of health. And those relate with urban quality. They have to do with your air pollution, with your traffic congestion, and so on. And so I think the pandemic somehow opened the eyes of the urban development box beyond the traditional planning and land use and housing and transport dynamics, and let's say allowed for more conversations across levels of government to maybe revisit some of the assumptions of what we put behind the urban box. So I would say in these federal governments, the challenge may be to connect in a coherent setting a myriad of local urban policies into that framework that can cope with shocks, in particular the pandemic, and their federal governments, through the usual stick and the carrot, play the role in enacting new legislations or in providing transfers, funding, grants across levels of government, access to credit in some cases, and trying to drive this vertical coordination and connected dots.
Thanks, Aziza. Maybe coming at the question from another angle as well, you did also highlight, I guess, the increasingly important role of mayors and of local administrations. Again, Australia, by international standards, has a very weak level of government at the local level that we have, below the state level. We have less powerful mayors and less powerful city governments than what we find in other countries where they're a bit more autonomous. Do you have any, I guess, thoughts or lessons internationally that speak to the Australian context in that regard, where perhaps where local government, local communities are not directly as strongly resourced and are needing to engage across other levels of government?
So we have done extensive work on decentralization at the OECD, devolution, and how to make it effective. I have to say, at the OECD, we don't have a normative
No.
standpoint saying you have to decentralize, but because we've not been able. Actually, it's a decade-old conversation to always correlate systematically, decentralization with economic, environmental, and social outcomes. Even if we know these outcomes cannot be achieved without a certain degree of decentralization. But what we've been saying is that when you decide, well, that's a political choice to decentralize, then you need to make it work and deliver. And we have produced these 10 guidelines, which I'll be happy to share with you. It's called OECD Handbook on Decentralization, Making It Work. Um, that strive precisely to avoid what you're saying, which is this mismatch between roles and responsibilities that are transferred to subnational governments and actually the financial and technical capacity to deal with them. What we hear often, to finish on that, is of course it's the chicken and the egg story. So we often hear national governments saying, we're not decentralizing because they don't have the capacity at the local level. And we make, a certain level of capacity a prerequisite to actually transfer prerogatives, even if we've seen some countries that are, Colombia is one of them, for example, opting for more asymmetric forms of decentralization, meaning not necessarily the same level for all levels of government across countries, but pilots and experimentations based on capacities that are in place. But the reality is that this is a learning process. The more you decentralize, the more you build the capacity, and rather than waiting for conditions to be in place ex ante. So it's really a subtle balance that has to be achieved, but recalling the expected outcomes economically, socially, environmentally, the capacities that are needed, the effective coordination, and restating that it's not because you decentralize from the national level that then you're just done and that's not your job anymore. Cities are really a shared responsibility, and so is urban development.
Thanks, Aziza. Unfortunately, I have to wrap up the conversation now. We've only got a bit less than 5 minutes left in this whole session before it ends. But look, thank you so much. Thank you once again for joining us so early in the morning, your time. We really appreciate the input that you've given to us this afternoon. So I do thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
I'd also like to thank all of our other speakers who appeared during the conference today. We really had a very strong and very deep lineup of speakers. I'd also like to thank all of you, our delegates, for joining us online. Although we weren't physically together, I hope you were able to get something out of the conference today. It has been a packed program, as I say. Please, if you didn't manage to catch everything, don't worry too much. Recordings of the sessions and the slides from each of today's presentations will be available in the online portal in the days ahead. So if you're registered for the conference, you can go back and look at all of those in your own time. In closing, I'd just once again like to extend our very heartfelt thanks to our conference partners, Infrastructure Australia and the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. And I'd also again like to thank our conference supporters, the Planning Institute of Australia, the Council of Capital City Lord Mayors, and the Australian Property Institute. So we thank our supporters and sponsors. Just to let you know, you will receive an email following the conference just asking for you to complete a short survey about your experience. And we do ask, if you don't mind, please taking the time to fill that in, because it does really help and inform us regarding our events. The email will also include the information that you need to know how to access the recordings from today's conference following the event. So that's really all we've got to cover today. So thank you. I think it's been a really interesting day right through from when we started with our welcome to country this morning, which I found I felt very welcome, and I think it was a very generous gift from Uncle Ringo, and then right through from our presentation from the ministers and the keynotes and the panel sessions. I really felt the conference sort of came together around a few really important themes, and I do encourage you to revisit any of the sessions after today that you may have missed or you want to see again. to take that forward. So from me, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you, hopefully in person, in the not too distant future. Goodbye.